We're in very good company, very intimate company, but very lovely company, and just such a treat to be here. And I think what's so interesting is, you know, we've got these two great creators here with very different vision, very different kind of aesthetic, but a lot of shared concerns as well. And I'm probably, because it's quite a small gathering of us, I'm not going to go into a lot of spiel about Nicole, because Selina's here. Anybody can ask Selina, the curator, specifically about Nicole, except I think it's very interesting that you both have your origins in the fashion business. Obviously Nicole as designer, you as Queen of Whistles and then Queen of Liberty, doing this work, and then moving into, both of you working in 3 dimensions in ceramics, using natural form. Obviously Nicole much more specifically figurative, but we will be talking more about the kind of natural organic forms in your work. But I guess just to kick off really, Lucille, you know, you talked about a wonderful Damascene moment you had wanting to work with ceramics when you came across this porcelain bowl at the V&A, which seemed to have a very important role. Even then, before then, when you went to drop a friend at a ceramics class and they gave you a lump of clay to play with, and you were just like, whoa! Tell us about what actually made you shift from fashion to these. I mean, it's a big arc.
I actually always collected working clay because I don't know what drew me to it, even when it was fired and dry and, you know, already made. But that moment you're talking about is when I walked. I fetched a girl. I took a girl to her class so that we could chat in the car.
This was a friend?
A friend of mine.
Yeah.
She was in fashion, actually.
And roughly whenabouts was this?
Oh gosh, about...
Roughly, I mean, just
12 years ago.
Okay.
And I literally walked down into that studio, and there was a certain smell that hit me, which was like being punched. You know, like sort of completely falling in love. And that hooked me. And then the teacher, while I was there, just said, oh, well, here's a lump of clay, why don't you just pinch a pot? And it's actually sitting somewhere. It's a salt bowl of salt. Every day we use that bowl, and it's completely my origin of loving clay.
That's lovely.
And it's very functional and handmade and wobbly and white. And so all these sort of beginnings of my life after that is encapsulated in the one tiny little bowl.
Then you went to the Working Men's College and learnt the full.
Learnt
well, not the full,
no,
because you can't learning forever. But you know, you learnt the basic techniques. You learnt about
there.
firing. You learnt about all that.
Yeah.
And that took you through, and then to the Royal College.
City Lit.
City Lit.
And then and that was marvellous, doing a 2-year diploma, because the tutors at City Lit are so amazing. Makers themselves, very, very generous with their... I think that's why I'm so generous generally with other people working in clay, because I learned that generosity is extremely important to pass on knowledge and share things. So they were amazing, and then they encouraged me to go to the Royal College.
But then when was your V&A Damascene moment? Because in a way that seems very important to me, because you work so much with traditional methods, within traditions. We'll talk probably a bit about your residency in China, doing all these different things. But then, so there you were in the V&A, and you saw this extraordinary pot, this bowl, the 18th century bowl, and that was something you said reached out to you.
It felt so modern. It was a tiny little bowl in one of those big vitrines that they have, you know, with sort of things in categories. And it's not really beautifully displayed or anything like that. It's just a sort of series of bowls lined up.
And why that
14th century, 15th century. It literally spoke to me. I don't know. It was behind a whole lot of other things. It was just a white bowl made out of a gourd, covered in flowers, slumped in this rather modern way. But it was made in 1740 in Saint-Cloud in France. And that set me on my sort of love of porcelain.
Fine porcelain.
Fine porcelain, yeah. White porcelain. And then I started reading about the origins of porcelain, which is fascinating. And the alchemists who were incarcerated by the kings, and not allowed out of the prisons and furnaces until they came up with A, gold, and B, porcelain, because I think there'd been a lot of trade between the East and West in porcelain, and I think the wealthy and the kings of Europe were tired of paying the prices that the Chinese and Japanese were charging for these things, and wanted to copy it and crack the secret of this, well, which thing would be called white gold now.
Because there's a lot to unpack there, because I think the tradition, the alchemy, and I'm going to quote something back to yourself. I'm going to quote you back to yourself because it's such a great quote. This gave me a whole lot of notes last weekend, as the sort of almost like stream of consciousness, thoughts, ideas, but there's a particularly great bit here. She puts material used: gilding, 23-carat gold leaf, lustring, electroforming, porcelain slips, casting, moulding, sculpting, breaking, cracking, hitting, punching, twisting, rolling, cutting, joining, firing, heating, drying, wetting, cajoling, I like cajoling, forcing, breaking, dipping, pushing, burning, melting glass, cooling. I mean, I love that, because that's got what you were just talking about, the alchemy, but also the many, many, many techniques that these are evident to in terms of all the things that I've just reeled off. And that kind of richness of tradition, of experimentation, of alchemy, of chance, a bit of magic, and you've got that lovely expression about the kiln gods. And I just want to talk just a little bit, we'll get you to talk a bit about the importance of actually making, because you blow your own glass, you do all this stuff yourself. It's very important, but you are an artist rather than seeing yourself as a craftsperson. So rein that little bit back in again, but let's just talk about the making, all those strange things that you do that makes it so exciting that comes out here.
I think I'm deeply wedded to craft. I'm deeply wedded to the origins of the material, and I'm quite obsessed with the material of porcelain. I find it really pure and really magnificent, and I almost think it's a violation sometimes to colour it, because it comes out of the earth. It's so pure, virginal, clean, really beautiful, and translucent and chalky at the same time, and it looks very different when you're working with it from when it dries out, and then when you biscuit, it comes out looking very disappointing, and then it looks very strange and sort of dusty, and then you put it in at a higher temperature again, it goes translucent again, and then you glaze it in various ways, and then there's other transformations to it. So in itself, porcelain in white is a fascinating subject to me. I'm sure it'll run its course at some point, because
you might introduce colour at some point. You've already had gold, and you've got different sorts of shades of.
For example,
and you've painted some of these, haven't you?
Yes.
Still monochrome though, still within a certain.
Well, I'm going through a monochrome stage in my life. Well, in fashion, I was really, I had colour everywhere, and I think I just moved on. And I think also living in this space it doesn't really want colour, a space like this. So my life is very sort of all-encompassing. The way I kind of dress, the interior that I have, maybe the material I work in, and the expression of that material in objects, I think is all very tied up in a very tight expression of myself. And a lot of the work is autobiographical, as well as historic, as well as concerned with nature and the humanities' effect on nature, and so on. I mean, there's a lot of concepts going on.
A lot of opposites too, it seems to me. I mean, nature, culture, you've got this sort of sense of different sorts of push me, pull you, they could either be erupting or possibly, is it creation or is it decay? There's a very cyclical feel about it. Is it positive or is it catastrophically negative? There's this kind of energy that's very unclear. They're kind of becoming your works. That's a lot of their energy is in the fact that they're not static. They're not resolved. I mean, they're resolved in a certain way aesthetically, but they're also unresolved in terms of possibility. And that kind of tension, that kind of playing with opposites, seems to be important to me.
I think you've got it in a nutshell. I think of them as very modern, but they're very tied to the 18th century, very tied to the beginnings. They express nature, yet they are never of nature. They're never prescriptively of nature. Yes, all those things. Is it the beginning of something, or is it the end of something? Is it bubbling under, or is it the result of that volcanic bubbling? But I think we are in a state of flux, and I think that that's caught it. Also trying to catch the movement of clay, because clay is malleable when you work it. It's sometimes actually liquid when you dip it. And then you put it in the kiln and it goes completely static and dry. And then in the kiln again, at higher temperatures, it melts completely. And then I'm trying to sort of keep that energy in the work, which is technically very difficult. And I've learned to make these forms where I make them straight up. For example, Babel, this piece here.
This one here?
No, the straight up one on the right.
Got it, this one
here,
yes.
That one is made in the same way as the one on the left up there. I'll try and push it over. So there's conversation with things. And try and make things, for example, like that, because I know that in the kiln they're going to go like that.
You're learning more and more, I imagine, what will happen in the kiln. I mean, you're learning this kind of, it's a science. I mean, what happens at certain heat levels, at certain things, but also there's a terrific, it seems to me, improvisational energy here. But I mean, do you have a sort of plan when you start, or is it very much in the making?
That's true to a certain extent, but I do start out with, I work in themes, series, and the series are all named. For example,
Alchemical Bodies,
yes.
Man's Quest for Obsolescence, that was the first one. Secret Life of a Pea, Post-Apocalyptic Regeneration, I love, they're great titles these. The Time Between the Time, that's now, isn't it, I think, and then you're working on Second Nature.
Yeah.
That's, but talk about them, I just
So
want to get them out, and I can...
They start out very strongly conceptually. That's why I've got a foot in craft, and I've got more of a foot in fine art in a way, because they are conceptual. And then, so I start up with the concept and the series, and then I name them. The names are really important to me, and I name what I'm going to do in that series.
Do you know before you, obviously you've got the overarching series, but do you name the individual pieces once you finish them, or do you actually give them a name while you're working?
Kind of before and while I'm working.
That's interesting, because a lot of artists will name afterwards. Yeah.
Sometimes I do, because it doesn't turn out, because, as you said, the kiln gods have their own agenda, and so anyone who makes will understand that you are subject to, there's no consistency that's guaranteed unless you're doing a sort of form which is beautifully thrown, or, clay has its own, and in fact, clay is so weird. If you're having an off day, or you're upset, don't ask the clay to do what you want it to do, because it does its own thing also. And so, it's a very emotional way of working.
So you have a narrative in a way when you start with a piece. I mean, obviously, if you're working in another medium, if you're making a painting or a sculpture, you will unless you're being completely performative, you still have that narrative. So I guess you've got that image in your head, not exactly the image physically, but the conceptual image of what you're aiming for, what you want to express. But then, as you say, you get surprised. I guess you get surprised by the clay spirits and the kiln gods as well. I mean, it's a medium that doesn't. I mean, paint changes, of course, as well. Other mediums change, but this is a particularly mutable medium, it seems.
And you have to open yourself, so you're watching it all the time, so you can take the advantage of some interesting thing that's happening, and then that takes you off on another bit of the journey somewhere else. And so it is, you can plan to a certain extent, and then you get confounded in some way.
You've talked a lot about fragments in the past, fragments, debris, recycling, these different elements that feed into your work as well. That sometimes sort of almost like found objects, the peas and the pods, for example, but then interspersed with much more kind of created forms that have been created by you out of your imagination.
Well, I've got a sort of language of shapes that I sort of keep coming back to. And so I do pre-make a lot of things. I've got umpteen boxes of pre-made things with plaster in the bottom, keeping them wet plaster, keeping it dry, keeping it wet, or some already fired, or some biscuit fired.
That's interesting. So you kind of assemble as well as
I assemble sometimes, yeah. But I mostly am making and assembling, and making and assembling, and then even if I've got dried pieces, sometimes I only want to use wet, so I remake them for that piece. I can't really describe exactly how I make them because it's
fascinating
so different
to have that sort of that sense of it, and also the influences that you draw on. I mean, they're fantastically eclectic. I think what we're looking at. I mean, and each of us, it's almost like looking into a sort of Rorschach or some kind of series of forms, where we can read our own interpretation, looking at cloud forms or natural forms, but also tremendous ornamentation. So you can have so many different threads of, I know that you've mentioned artists like Louise Bourgeois, Kiki Smith, Anselm Kiefer, but also Hieronymus Bosch, also natural forms, coral, leaves, lava we've talked about. I mean, all these different debris that you found in the street as a kid, bits of metal that you didn't chuck out and your mother got fed up about it. All these different kinds of aspects all seem to feed in. They're very autobiographical in that way, but also very conceptual.
Very autobiographical. And sometimes only I can see it. And perhaps someone else can't see it, because then they sort of say, no, it just looks like seaweed or coral or something. But in fact, it's got intensely personal references in it, abstractions of things, and sometimes just emotions in certain shapes.
Do things surprise you sometimes?
Yes.
I mean, that must be part of the process.
I think that's why, I'm a typical Leo. I get kind of bored and want to go off, but I think the freshness of it, it's like an adventure every day, and you're never sure of the way it's going to turn out. And you have to keep alert all the time to the piece.
That's interesting. Just to go back to the art craft, because this is Craft Week, and I think it's really interesting that, more and more. I remember back in the dawn of time, I was writing a book for Tate about the London art world in the early 90s, and I put this guy that I knew, had known since the mid-80s actually, Grayson Perry, this boyfriend of my friend Jennifer, who was a much more successful painter than he was then. And I remember the Tate guy going, Sandy Nairn actually, going, what do you call this potter? This potter? And, really outraged. I was putting it in this book of, A Guide to British Art Now. And it was very interesting. I mean, that wasn't that long ago. It was the first version of it was published in 1997. There was a real hierarchy, and I wrote about him first of all for Crafts magazine, which Grayson found quite funny because he actually really wasn't. He'd make his coil pots, and they were very wonky, and they were made in evening classes. Now, of course,
he started out at City Lit too.
Yeah, he did, exactly. I mean, and Christine Binney, his girlfriend Jennifer's sister, was doing evening classes there, and said, why don't you try it out, Grayson? That's so what he was doing. And she introduced him to pots. That's all been slightly rewritten out of history. but what I'm really saying is there was this all these different demarcations, and people are still quite, I'm a maker. Differences. Now, of course, contemporary artists, the Frieze Art Fair next week will be full of stuff made in ceramic and indeed textile, and nobody sees any difference. And then they'll go back again and do something. It seems like you actually were doing this, before. I mean, you were very much a harbinger of this idea that there isn't really a demarker. It's important for you to make, but these are as much artworks as crafted works, or as much crafted works. The craft is crucial to the artistry, and the art, the conceptual ideas, the medium and the message are completely intertwined. That's what I'm trying to say in a rather garbled way. You know, these hierarchies are quite porous, it seems to me.
And it's a sort of strange hierarchy, because people who work in wood aren't called woodists, are they?
Yeah.
Or steelists, or...
Well, Michelangelo wasn't called a carver, was he?
No,
you know?
he wasn't.
I mean, it is interesting, I think.
And at the Royal College, there was one moment of horror for me, because I was trying to defend my work, because it didn't have beautiful edges of things and so on. And one of the tutors to me said to me, "What do you think you're here for? To make art?" And I went, "Yes." And they went,
It's called the Royal College of Art, after all.
I mean, and that was a hugely Damascene moment for me, because then I realised that I'd have to forge my own way and just have to stick to it and just be confident, you know. And one isn't confident. And yet, at the end of that show, I'd sold every piece. I'd sold every single piece of my show.
Well, there you go.
And then was doing commissions after that, which was amazing. And there was, you know, the traditional people who were working clay not kind of really seeing that there was that unity between working in clay and doing fine art. So,
what are the ones that you've painted? I mean, I'm interested in the grey ones. Because I thought, because I'm such an ignoramus about things, ceramics, I'm the worst person who's done these conversations. I'm so bad and all that. But you know, I said, "Oh, you filed this," and you said, "No, I haven't filed it. I've painted it." It's a different.
It's with a pen, and it's Chinese ink.
That's interesting.
So
sort of calligraphy into the ceramics almost. I mean, another tradition. Obviously, it's you're not doing calligraphy. You're using the materials for that.
I started out in fine art, not very long, because I was in South Africa, and I realised it wasn't really. I did it, and I think I was much too young. When I'm in South Africa,
I was actually going to ask you about that.
I do draw. I've got a wonderful, huge model with a huge big bottom and tiny little waist, and I draw her, and I draw with a friend, and because we don't have...
So life drawing, basically.
Life drawing. And so I love drawing when I'm there. I draw for 2 months, because I've got no kiln, I've got no way to play there. And I do draw. I didn't show my drawings, and I actually draw everything out before I make it. I've got scodges of notebooks, and all these musings that I've sent you.
Yes.
I just type them out because they're written by the pieces.
Yeah.
So it feels a bit disjointed, that maybe, but
no, it was lovely. I love that because it had such I can like the work. It had such great energy to it that you didn't. I mean, you it wasn't for publication or anything. You just gave it to me. It was a lovely insight into your mind, jumping from one thing to another and thinking about different things and seizing on something and then going off in somewhere else. You know, it was very illuminating, I thought, actually. Yeah.
There's a lot of preparation and a lot of planning, even though it doesn't look like it.
Well, that's what makes them look so spontaneous, because they're underpinned by all that. You know, I mean, it is just the time that you spend. Obviously, you could argue that you spend, you know, that whole thing about the Matisse, the one line and 30 years of experience. All that, of course, but nonetheless, it's still it's labour, and that's very interesting. I think that it is a very kind of intricate process, and also, you know, things can go wrong. I mean, stuff doesn't work in the kiln sometimes. You know, it's a whole. Again, the kiln gods can get a bit, you know, stroppy sometimes.
And you still have to pay your electricity, you have to pay your studio costs, and you have to pay your material costs. And so there is cost to it, and you can sort of make cases for both sides, really.
But it has a more pernicious kind of result in that if you can't get a higher price, no West End gallery will take it, because if you did a sellout show of your work, you still wouldn't be able to cover the London rent for the gallery. So it also stops West End fine art galleries, or galleries that deal with contemporary and modern art, from taking ceramics, because they can't charge the higher prices that will pay for the gallery in the West End. So it is within itself, it contains a block on ceramics being able to move up to the same level as art. So we're sort of stuck in a kind of holding pattern with that.
I think it goes back also to sort of education of not people not understanding the true cost of anything that's made. I mean, it doesn't matter what it is, the fact that people now just go to IKEA or buy everything cheap or on Amazon, and just not understanding what the cost is of anything really around them. And I think there needs to be much more work about, with artists of any form, actually understanding everything that goes into it, you know, how many hours or years or
artists should get
materials.
paid better. I mean, there's a whole scandal about the way in which institutions treat artists when they get commissioned to do projects with them, you know, because you're meant to be full-tuggingly grateful that, you know, a publicly funded institution is commissioning something from you. I mean, I think Lynette Yardan-Barke, you could argue she has huge market prices, so doesn't need the money, but I think she got, I think it was like, I don't know, 10 grand fee or something by Tate for that whole enormous show, you know, installing it, you know, I mean, it's not what you can live on. I mean, she was years preparing that show, you know, and okay, she's doing fine, but the fact that even artists of that stature, it's so interesting that they are really, really very, very ungenerous about that, because it sort of almost seemed like a vocation. I mean, of course, I would argue that artists are artists because they have to be artists. You know, if you're looking in the rearview mirror and wondering about your career all the time, you're probably not that great an artist in the first place. I've learned from experience looking at artists who do care like that, and the work doesn't really stand up. But it is shocking how exploitative the whole situation is, I think, for artists and indeed makers, and indeed across the board. It is really interesting, I think. But on a more sort of lofty note, I wanted
That's
to
an
talk to you.
interesting point, though.
Yeah, but I think it is. It's something to discuss over many drinks,
Yes.
many times. But I think just to get back to you and your practice, because I mean, it's very interesting seeing different phases, different themes coming through. So talk to me about the most recent works that you're making, and talk to me about where you feel. And obviously, you haven't got a crystal ball, but just, you know, how they're configuring, and where you feel you're going with this new series of work.
There's a lot of this is new. A lot of this is done in the last year.
Right.
And
lockdown was good for
lockdown was
productivity.
good for productivity, really, except for the first month or so, where I was completely frozen and couldn't do anything at all. My brain just wouldn't work. And then when it did start to work, it was just unlocked this huge accumulation of everything. I think also because we had time to rest our brains, and so we could collect our thoughts, and what came out for me was so much more cogent, so much more easy for me to understand what was coming out of me. So because there was only that I was doing, I was concentrating on and focusing on the output of my emotions and my brain.
And what do you think differentiates?
Having to go to the opening of an envelope.
So what do you think differentiates this new phase? What do you think? How would? I mean, obviously we can bring our own ideas to it, and that's what's so great about this work, is each one of us sitting here will look at it and see different things and bring different associations. And to my mind, that's what great art does, because you own it yourself in your head. But from your point of view, what do you feel? You know, that period of enforced contemplation, if you like. What do you feel it's brought out in your work?
It might sound like a cliche, but it actually just made me really look at my work and assess it and find the good things in it and the things I wanted to take forward and the interests that I have in it. It also gave me confidence that, you know, with art being influenced by the world around me, that whatever I was outputting was actually honest, and it really came from an internal source of my creativity. When the babble of society lets you get on with your life, what comes out is well thought out and very clear and easier to make in a way. And one of my tutors was doing some work with me recently, and she said, you never open your emails until the evening. I actually don't.
Very wise.
I don't do, you know, I can't look at emails during the day. I almost don't want to have conversations. I want to work in complete silence and complete peace. I don't listen to the radio. I don't, unless I'm doing something very mechanical.
Am I being really corny, or is this some kind of reaction to those decades spent in the fashion business, which was just cacophonous, I would imagine, and collections and business considerations and new lines, and I mean, it's a very, very demanding, to put it mildly, situation to be in, where you're being pulled in all directions all at the same time.
I think I learned a work ethic, which is great, because I bring that to my work now. But it was a very noisy, exhausting time, and every bit of creativity was last minute and frantic and collaborative and noisy. And now I'm much more internal, much more meditative, selfish.
That's right.
In a sense, because I am doing, there's no commercial considerations for my output now. Before it had to be 3/4 black and navy blue and grey, with 3 colours that were commercial that would work, even though it was very creative. But I did design, I did buy all the fabrics, I did all the coloration, and I ran the design studio. So, but it was more...
This energy's coming to this now, it seems to me.
Yeah, the energy's just transferred, and it's much more personal, autobiographical, deeper.
Actually, sitting here, what they remind me of, which hadn't really occurred to me before, are the philosopher's stones, Chinese philosopher's stones. All these amazingly various natural forms that actually look quite extraordinary, as if they could almost not be made by nature, but they kind of fulfill the look of Lucy, I think, said paintings and sculptures are machines for creating emotion.
It's really interesting.
There's that sense
There's
a sense with the philosopher's stone that the same thing you contemplated these extraordinary objects physically, conceptually, and in a way that seems to be, to me, something that just runs through these.
Well, you've got my little book that I gave you, the little book of, you've got the PDF anyway.
Yes.
You've got, in the little book, I was, funny enough, we've got a house in South Africa on the beach, and I was brought up on the beach. And I've been making these sort of things for a long, long time. And then there was a huge storm that threw up lots of coral intertwined with things. And I picked it up from the beach, and I haven't decorated the house because you can't find things there anyway. It's very simple, the house. And I put it into sort of like little vignettes, little stories of things. And then I was photographed, somebody wanted some photographs of something, and I started photographing them, and then to my amazement I realised that these were forms that were apparent in my work, that were on the beach in the Cape in South Africa, that I'd grown up with. They'd been embedded in my brain, embedded in my
your psyche,
soul, my psyche, and had come out in my fingers, the clay.
It's so interesting now because you've got Theaster Gates at the Whitechapel,
yes,
and indeed White Cube, with these who trained as astronomers, and then took these. These are gorgeous pots, and I'd be drinking my sake or whatever out of them like nobody's business. They're lovely, but they're arranged in a very non-functional way. But they're also arranged in quite a functional way at the same time, because they're on the shelves, they're in drawers, you can pull them out and look at them. He's mixed up the whole kind of politics of ceramics, and it's a really rich conceptual show. But they are irrefutably pots. I would argue, I'm not such a huge fan of the Edmund Duval serial arrangement. We talked about this earlier, but Gagosian very happily flogging great vitrines worth of his stuff as well. So that's, again, it's a sort of interesting moment, I think, now, where these ideas are just becoming completely fluid, as they should be, and interconnected, and there isn't a sense of it being a poor relative or an artisanal thing. There's a sense of it becoming much more about the making and about the thinking, and about the two often coalesce. Or sometimes people just want to be really brilliant at throwing a fantastic pot and not actually having a whole lot of conceptual stuff attached to it, and that's completely valid as well.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
There is a hierarchy, though, I must say, that I find. It's in pricing.
Yes.
And I don't know if you all, if that's something that you find. Maybe that's being challenged now, and I hope it is. But as soon as you work in clay, or you're automatically got a sort of price ceiling on it.
Really?
I quite like to ask about something that we touched on earlier, which is the titles of the series, and they are wonderful titles, and they do seem to embody this incredible sort of dichotomy that Louisa spoke about. And I'd love to just hear a bit more about where the titles come from.
The first title, Alchemical Bodies, came from the beginnings of porcelain and the alchemists, and that led me into the study, into the Enlightenment in Europe, and the chaos that was involved in that whole movement, psychologically, economically, socially. And so that Alchemical Bodies, and then I did my dissertation on how people change their bodies for art. So
like people like that.
Like Olam, who was recorded changing her vagina on film, which was streamed to 5 continents in live.
And having her face made like a composite of old masters, the horns and the special nose from a Leonardo and the forehead from a Memling or whatever it was. Yeah, extraordinary.
Sterlack, who put an ear on his arm and also had himself pierced and then suspended above in a crane above Sydney Harbour, and actually met him at the Royal College. He was one of the visiting lecturers, which was really very life-changing for me. You can imagine. Dancers, Louise Bourgeois put on her weird and wonderful
polyp
things, which were sort of taken up by Ray Kurokawa in her work in fashion, and Kiki Smith, for example, Louise Bourgeois, and Sim Kiefer with his desperation of landscape, so that was Alchemical Bodies. Oh, then the time between time was a kind of political moment where I was looking at the way the world was changing, and I didn't know whether it was the end of that time, the beginning of the next time, or it was time suspended while we were sorting ourselves out to understand what's happening in our lives now. And then at that same time, Trump came in to power, and then I did a series of work entitled The Forest of No Consequences, where I tore up work and then redid it and then clumped it together again. So that was time between time, and I'm still a bit in time between time, because I think those things
the
are
time's
still...
gone a bit crazy, hasn't it?
And then the concertinery of time through COVID, which time was like a huge hullabaloo in my brain. Time was either it was long or short. I never knew what day it was. So time between time. Then The Secret Life of a Pea, which was done. I had to do a lot of research to go to China to a residency because I didn't have long there. So that was a huge body of work of research in a small time scale for making. And then this new theme I'm looking at is called Second Nature. So it's the time after...
Seems rather more positive. It's like something becoming
Second Nature, but also Second Nature is post-human with artificial intelligence, which is very disquieting.
Not so positive.
And I think maybe the biggest threat to humankind than even climate change. But on a positive note, the regeneration of people's attention to climate change, and actually, very quickly now deciding, maybe too late, that we've got to do something about it. So Second Nature has got many, many layers, but I think it's a much more positive thing. And in Second Nature, I'm also looking at metal and, what's the word? You put metal in a bath. Electroplating. So more electroplating than I did at college, much more additions and inclusions with glass that I'm doing. So things, like cyborgs and people changing their bodies and
prosthetics
and so on. So I'm using that sort of theme within clay with other materials.
So interesting.
So that's second nature. It's a new invention of nature. It's a new attitude that we've got as our nature. And when things become second nature to you, they take it on and become part of our life. So I'm hoping that that's going to happen.